St. Kitts, a small jewel in the Caribbean, gleamed under the relentless tropical sun, its verdant hills rolling toward the horizon where the Atlantic met the sky. The island's beauty, however, was a mask that concealed a world of unimaginable suffering. Behind the sugarcane fields, stretching endlessly across the fertile plains, lay a society built on cruelty and exploitation, a society in which human lives were treated as mere tools to extract wealth. The island's wealth was staggering by 18th century standards, and the sugar plantations produced fortunes for European colonists who lived in comfort and opulence. But this prosperity came at an unspeakable cost. Every mound of sugar, every gleaming barrel shipped to Europe, was stained with the blood, sweat, and tears of those enslaved toiling under the sun. From dawn until dusk, the enslaved labored in conditions designed to break the body and the spirit. The cane fields were a relentless expanse, swaying in the wind, deceptively serene, hiding the backbreaking work they demanded. Cane cutting was grueling, the stalk sharp enough to draw blood with a single slip of the hand. Enslaved men and women were forced to move at the pace dictated by overseers wielding whips and cruel words, their bodies punished for any perceived hesitation or weakness. Beyond the fields, the work continued, processing cane into sugar, hauling heavy loads, tending to livestock, and performing domestic labor in the grand plantation houses. Every task, every motion, was measured, watched, and often punished with merciless precision. The living quarters of the enslaved were stark, crude huts built of wood and thatch, scattered at the periphery of the plantations. These dwellings offered little protection against the elements. Rain seeped through roofs during storms, heat pressed down relentlessly during the day, and at night, the humid air offered no relief. Families were crammed into these small spaces, children sleeping alongside adults, often separated from parents when owners decided to sell them. Food was meager and monotonous: cassava, beans, and whatever scraps could be spared from the plantation kitchens. Malnutrition and disease were constant companions, further eroding strength and hope. Within this oppressive system, the social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. European colonists occupied the pinnacle of power, their lives cushioned by wealth, privilege, and the labor of hundreds. Beneath them, the overseers and managers enforced rules, acting as instruments of fear, ensuring the enslaved remained subservient. And at the very bottom, the enslaved lived under a regime designed to deny them both freedom and dignity. Any spark of autonomy or resistance was brutally extinguished. Laws codified oppression, ensuring that escape or defiance carried the harshest consequences, and rumors of mutilation or execution served as terrifying examples. Yet, despite the omnipresent fear, human spirit clung stubbornly to life. Small acts of resistance, hiding food, breaking tools, secretly singing songs of sorrow or hope, persisted. The enslaved developed an intricate culture of survival and subtle defiance. Through whispered conversations in the shadows of the cane, stories were passed from generation to generation, tales of ancestors who resisted, of courage under impossible odds. These stories became the quiet heartbeat of a population longing for freedom, a testament to resilience amid brutality. Colonial society, meanwhile, maintained a veneer of civility and progress. Elegant manor houses, manicured gardens, and bustling markets presented an image of prosperity and order. Visitors to the island might have been dazzled by the outward appearance, the scent of sugar and spices mingling in the air, the rhythmic cadence of laborers seemingly industrious in the distance. Few could imagine the reality beneath the surface, that every loaf of sugar, every coin earned, was the result of lives lived in terror, fear, and exhaustion. The stark contrast between wealth and suffering formed a silent tension that pervaded the island, an invisible pressure building beneath the everyday routines of both enslaved and masters alike. In the evenings, when the day's labor ended, the enslaved returned to their huts, carrying the weight of physical exhaustion and psychological strain. Fires flickered dimly, casting shadows on faces worn beyond their years. Children played quietly, learning early that noise could invite punishment, and adults shared stories in whispers, carefully avoiding the ears of any overseer who might be nearby. These nightly gatherings were not just moments of rest. They were small acts of cultural preservation, spaces where humanity could still assert itself against the machinery of oppression. It was in this world of extremes, beauty and horror, wealth and suffering, control and defiance, that the seeds of rebellion quietly germinated. Every lash, every stolen moment of hope, every whispered tale of freedom planted ideas in the minds of the enslaved. While European colonists lived in a bubble of security and arrogance, the enslaved began to understand the fragile foundations of their oppressor's power. They observed patterns, studied routines, and measured weaknesses. In this harsh landscape, awareness of injustice slowly morphed into a dangerous, exhilarating concept, the possibility of revolt. The tension between light and darkness, hope and despair, defined the everyday experience on St. Kitts. For the enslaved, life was a constant negotiation with danger, a careful balancing act between survival and aspiration. For the colonists, it was a calculated dominion, maintaining authority through intimidation, violence, and the illusion of permanence. The two worlds coexisted in a precarious equilibrium, each unaware of when or how it might shatter. And shatter it would. For within the hearts of the oppressed, a desire for freedom simmered quietly but relentlessly, waiting for the right moment to ignite. A moment that would send flames across the plantations and forever mark St. Kitts with a story that history would almost forget. In these shadows over sugar, the stage was set. The land, beautiful and deadly, had borne witness to centuries of exploitation. The people, stripped of freedom but not of spirit, were poised on the edge of defiance. The ordinary world, structured and ordered by colonial rule, hid a storm that was gathering silently yet inexorably. And when that storm finally broke, it would change the island forever. In the shadows of the cane fields, beneath the scorching Caribbean sun, a quiet tension began to take root. The enslaved, though stripped of freedom and dignity, were never entirely silent. Their voices, hushed and cautious, carried messages of hope, resentment, and resistance. It was in these secret conversations, exchanged in the privacy of night or behind the cover of dense sugarcane, that the seeds of rebellion were first planted. Every whisper, every furtive glance, every subtle act of defiance became a thread weaving the fragile fabric of insurrection. They spoke of liberty in tones low enough that the overseers could not hear, passing stories of ancestors who had resisted, of distant lands where people were not shackled, and of dreams that the mind alone could not be forced to forget. The island itself seemed complicit in these hidden communications. Narrow pathways between fields, dense groves, and abandoned huts became meeting places for planning, for sharing information, and for creating networks of trust. Enslaved men and women learned to watch one another, to recognize signals, subtle movements, and coded messages in songs sung under their breath. The spiritual songs that echoed through the night carried meanings layered beyond the melodies, messages that might encourage a fellow laborer to endure or to act when the moment came. Every ritual, every cultural expression became a form of silent rebellion, asserting a humanity that the system sought to erase. It was not merely hope that drove these whispers. It was the intimate knowledge of cruelty. Every lash from the whip, every beating for trivial mistakes, every family torn apart by sale and trade, reinforced the urgency of change. The enslaved observed the routines of their oppressors with sharp eyes, noting the times when guards slept lightly, when overseers were distracted, and when plantations were vulnerable. They mapped patterns of labor, routes of patrols, and points of weakness. In these careful observations, the enslaved discovered a power their masters could never fully understand, the ability to act collectively with intelligence, strategy, and patience. Among the enslaved, certain individuals emerged as natural leaders. They were not recognized by the colonists, of course, nor would they ever be acknowledged in the official records. These leaders were often older, experienced in survival, or unusually brave, carrying with them the weight of personal loss and the fire of justice. They spoke cautiously, knowing that exposure could mean death. Yet their words carried influence. They organized small groups, taught others techniques for evading surveillance, and quietly inspired a sense of unity. In every whispered conversation, a sense of inevitability grew. Freedom was not merely a dream. It was a possibility worth risking everything for. The atmosphere on the island during this time was charged with tension. The colonists, absorbed in their pursuit of wealth and distracted by luxuries, often failed to notice the storm forming around them. They relied on fear and punishment, believing it sufficient to maintain control, and were blind to the bonds forming among the enslaved. It was in this blindness that opportunity grew. The enslaved, through patience and cunning, began to cultivate resources, makeshift weapons, hidden stores of food, and carefully rehearsed plans. Every preparation was meticulous because they knew the stakes were absolute. A single misstep could mean death for all involved, but each small success, each unnoticed defiance, strengthened their courage. Even the most mundane aspects of plantation life became opportunities for subtle rebellion. Enslaved individuals delayed their work strategically, feigned ignorance, or subtly sabotaged machinery. These acts were small, yet they were powerful, reminders that control was never complete, that human will could not be entirely subdued. The colonists interpreted delays and mistakes as laziness or incompetence, unaware that they were witnessing the early murmurs of coordinated resistance. The enslaved cultivated patience, understanding that the right moment for action could not be forced. It had to emerge naturally, in a way that would maximize impact and survival. Rumors of revolts on neighboring islands circulated like sparks in dry grass. Tales of bravery and defiance in distant plantations inspired hope, feeding the imagination of those who had never known freedom. The enslaved listened closely to these stories, weighing them, learning from them, and incorporating lessons into their own emerging plans. These whispered accounts, often exaggerated or romanticized, served a dual purpose. They were both warning and inspiration, reinforcing the idea that rebellion was dangerous yet possible. Fear, paradoxically, became a tool as well. The enslaved used the colonists' own reputation for brutality to motivate one another. They reminded themselves of what awaited those who submitted, of the lives lost to arbitrary violence, of children ripped from their parents. This fear, transformed into determination, forged a sense of unity that was essential for survival. They knew that only by acting together, by moving as a single, coordinated force, could they hope to overcome the terrifying odds stacked against them. As months passed, the clandestine network strengthened. Meetings in hidden clearings, exchanges of food and tools, and coded signals among the workers created a web of trust and strategy. Each participant understood that exposure could be fatal, yet each remained committed to a vision of liberation that demanded extraordinary courage. The enslaved learned to read one another with precision, to discern loyalty and hesitation, and to allocate tasks according to individual skills. Leaders emerged naturally, guiding their fellow laborers toward a collective goal that was as dangerous as it was necessary. By the time the first night of planning gave way to the dawn of action, the enslaved of St. Kitts had transformed patience and suffering into strategy and resolve. What had begun as whispers in the shadows had grown into a plan of defiance so bold that it threatened to upend the carefully constructed order of the plantations. Every step, every glance, every song carried meaning. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and the undeniable promise of change. The stage was no longer merely set for a rebellion. It was breathing, pulsing, waiting for the moment when the oppressed would seize their destiny and strike back at the system that had sought to crush them for generations. The night before the uprising was a fragile balance between anticipation and fear. Darkness cloaked the sugarcane fields, providing cover for the enslaved as they moved silently between huts and groves, exchanging last-minute plans and whispered instructions. Each person knew that discovery meant certain death, yet courage and desperation outweighed fear. Small fires, carefully controlled, illuminated the determined faces of those who would risk everything for a fleeting taste of freedom. The air was thick with the scent of humidity, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. In hushed tones, leaders reminded their companions of the targets, the overseers' quarters, storehouses of weapons, and the grand houses that symbolized oppression. Every step was calculated, Every glance could signal danger or opportunity. As the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, the enslaved moved into position. Cane stalks whispered in the morning breeze, masking their approach as they crept toward the estates. The quiet was punctuated only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustle of leaves, but beneath the surface, tension pulsed like a living thing. When the first flames ignited, they were small, almost insignificant, yet they spread quickly across the dry grass and thatched roofs. Smoke curled into the sky, twisting in grotesque patterns as if the very air mourned the destruction it bore witness to. The plantations, once symbols of control and power, were transformed into a landscape of chaos and uncertainty. Panic erupted among the colonists and overseers as they awoke to the crackling fires and the sudden realization that their world was under attack. Shouts echoed across the fields, but they were met with resistance, with determination forged in decades of oppression. The enslaved struck swiftly, using axes, torches, and whatever weapons they could muster. There was no hesitation. Each action was deliberate, aimed at dismantling the infrastructure that had enslaved them. Horses bolted, dogs barked, and the sudden clang of metal reverberated across the plantations. The violence was terrifying, raw, and immediate, but it was not mindless. It was strategic, a coordinated assault on the structures and symbols of tyranny. In the chaos, stories emerged of extraordinary bravery. Men and women moved as shadows, navigating through smoke and debris, rescuing comrades, and targeting the most critical points of control. The colonists, confident in their dominance, were unprepared for the ferocity and precision of the rebellion. Panic spread quickly, and fear took root in the hearts of those who had long wielded power with impunity. The enslaved knew the odds were against them. Capture or death was a certainty for many. Yet in those first hours of the revolt, hope burned brighter than the fires consuming the plantations. It was a brief, brilliant assertion of human will against an oppressive system that had sought to crush it completely. The soundscape of the rebellion was one of terror and defiance intertwined. Screams, commands, and the clash of weapons filled the air, yet beneath the surface, there was an eerie rhythm. The enslaved moved with an almost instinctual coordination, understanding that hesitation could be fatal. They used the terrain to their advantage, disappearing into cane fields and ditches, emerging where least expected, striking quickly, and vanishing just as fast. It was a dance of survival and vengeance, choreographed by those who had long been denied agency over their own lives. The psychological impact on the colonists was immediate. They had underestimated the courage and intelligence of those they had enslaved. Amidst the destruction, moments of personal sacrifice and heroism appeared. A young man shielded a child from harm, an elder led comrades through a perilous escape route, and a woman protected her family while striking blows against her oppressors. Each act added depth to the narrative of rebellion, demonstrating that it was not only an organized assault, but also a profoundly human struggle. The uprising was more than a fight for survival. It was a declaration of identity, dignity, and defiance against a system designed to erase both. As the morning progressed, fires raged unchecked across several plantations. The enslaved understood that their actions would bring reprisals, but they also knew that standing by silently was no longer an option. Every torch lit, every building set aflame, every confrontation faced with courage was a statement. They were no longer willing to accept their chains as permanent. The physical destruction mirrored the emotional and psychological upheaval that had been simmering for years. The rebellion was both literal and symbolic, a manifestation of decades of suffering channeled into decisive, dangerous action. By mid-morning, the island was transformed. Smoke obscured the horizon, black clouds drifting across the landscape as the fires consumed what had once been symbols of oppression. The colonists scrambled to organize resistance, calling upon militias and loyal overseers, yet the enslaved had already vanished into hidden paths, leaving chaos in their wake. Their movement was fluid, unpredictable, and relentless. What had begun as whispers in the shadows had erupted into a full-scale confrontation with historical significance, an event that would leave an indelible mark on the memory of St. Kitts, whether acknowledged or suppressed by the colonial record. The human dimension of the rebellion was as powerful as the physical. Fear, courage, anger, and hope intertwined in every action, every glance, and every decision. The enslaved faced unimaginable risk, yet they pressed forward with a sense of inevitability, understanding that this was their only chance to assert autonomy in a world designed to deny it. Even as the fires consumed the estates, they carried with them the memory of those who had suffered before, ensuring that every act of defiance was rooted in both personal survival and collective justice. By the time the smoke began to thin and the fires reached their peak, the initial phase of the rebellion had achieved its most critical goals: disruption, destruction, and a profound psychological shock to the colonists. Yet, the aftermath was uncertain, and the enslaved knew that survival beyond the first hours was a separate, equally perilous battle. The rebellion had begun, and its echoes would reverberate across the island, setting the stage for both tragedy and legend, for loss and the flickering promise of freedom that had been denied for generations. The smoke from the burning plantations had barely begun to curl into the sky when the harsh reality of consequences descended upon the island. The initial thrill of rebellion was swiftly replaced by fear, uncertainty, and a grim understanding that retaliation would be merciless. The colonists, enraged and humiliated, moved with brutal precision, deploying militias, hiring mercenaries, and calling upon loyal overseers to hunt down those who dared to challenge their authority. The night's triumph of the enslaved, their moment of defiance, had ignited a storm that no one could easily contain. Every hut, every hidden path, and every field became potential territory for pursuit. The enslaved who had fought bravely now faced an environment of pervasive danger. Some were captured almost immediately, dragged back to the plantations in chains, their bodies battered, their heads hung low in despair. Punishments were unimaginably cruel. Beatings, whippings, public executions, and mutilation served not only as retribution, but as a warning to others who might contemplate defiance. Families were torn apart once again, a grim echo of the systemic cruelty that had forced them into rebellion in the first place. The psychological terror inflicted on the survivors rivaled any physical torment, leaving scars invisible yet indelible. Betrayal lurked in unexpected places. Some enslaved, whether out of fear or self-preservation, disclosed the locations of rebels or plans of escape. The colonists exploited these fissures expertly, turning desperation into a tool for control. Trust became a rare commodity, and loyalty, though still present, carried the weight of life or death. Even the most courageous individuals had to navigate a web of suspicion and danger, never fully certain whom they could rely upon. The rebellion, initially a unified front of resistance, began to fracture under the pressure of survival and the relentless hunt for vengeance. Amid the chaos, tales of personal tragedy and heroism intertwined. Some rebels fought to their last breath, refusing capture, their defiance immortalized in whispers among survivors. Others sacrificed themselves to ensure the safety of children, family members, or fellow comrades. These acts of courage, though costly, became the emotional core of the rebellion's story, illustrating the profound human stakes at play. Each individual faced moral choices with no correct answers: fight or flee, protect oneself or risk everything for others. The enormity of these decisions, forced under impossible circumstances, revealed the depth of both despair and strength among the enslaved. The colonists, consumed by fear of further uprisings, implemented stricter controls. Surveillance intensified, punishments became more frequent, and the already harsh laws grew more rigid. Fear of rebellion lingered long after the flames were extinguished, creating a tense atmosphere that permeated every aspect of plantation life. The enslaved, though momentarily empowered by their audacious revolt, now had to navigate a world where liberty had been chased back into shadows. This delicate balance between defiance and survival defined the days and nights following the uprising, an invisible pressure weighing on all who had dared to hope for change. Psychologically, the aftermath was devastating. Survivors carried the trauma of violence witnessed, of comrades lost, and of families torn apart. Sleep was haunted by memories of fire, screams, and betrayal. Even for those who had escaped immediate capture, the knowledge that the colonists would relentlessly pursue them fostered a pervasive anxiety, an understanding that freedom could be fleeting. Emotional resilience became as crucial as physical agility, and the enslaved relied upon clandestine networks of support, whispered reassurances, and the memories of shared defiance to maintain hope in a world dominated by cruelty. The rebellion also exposed fractures within the enslaved community itself. While some had united under shared oppression, the pressures of survival revealed differences in courage, loyalty, and priorities. Some fled at the first sign of danger, others fought to the bitter end. These contrasts complicated the narrative of the uprising, highlighting the human complexity behind acts of rebellion. There was no singular hero or villain. Instead, there existed a spectrum of human responses to unimaginable pressure, each shaped by circumstance, fear, and instinct. The rebellion, once a cohesive force, became a series of individual struggles for life and meaning. In the wider context, the uprising sent shockwaves across the island. Neighboring plantations intensified their security measures, reinforcing walls, erecting barriers, and increasing patrols. The white colonists, terrified of contagion, spread rumors of extreme punishments to deter imitation. Yet, even in the face of such oppression, the memory of defiance persisted. Stories of the rebellion traveled quietly through the enslaved community, carried in whispered songs, secret conversations, and coded messages. The flame of resistance, though physically suppressed, survived in the hearts of those who refused to forget. The brutality of the aftermath underscored the perilous nature of revolt under slavery. It revealed the stark contrast between the fleeting power of rebellion and the entrenched mechanisms of oppression. The enslaved who had dared to rise were reminded that courage alone could not guarantee survival, and that the cost of freedom might be unbearably high. Yet, even in the shadow of blood and betrayal, a psychological shift had occurred. The colonists could no longer view the enslaved as wholly compliant. The rebellion, though crushed in immediate terms, planted an enduring awareness of agency, courage, and the capacity for defiance. By the time order, however fragile, was restored, St. Kitts bore the scars of both physical destruction and emotional upheaval. Fires had left fields charred, buildings reduced to rubble, and plantations marked by the evidence of resistance. The enslaved were left to grapple with both loss and survival, carrying memories of heroism, betrayal, and profound suffering. The aftermath demonstrated the cruel paradox of rebellion under oppression. It could inspire and devastate, liberate and endanger, uplift and destroy in equal measure. Even decades later, the stories of those who had risked everything during the uprising persisted in quiet corners of the island. The acts of bravery and defiance became part of an oral history, a testament to the human desire for freedom, the emotional cost of resistance, and the brutal lengths to which those in power would go to preserve control. The rebellion, bloodied and battered as it was, had not disappeared entirely. It had simply retreated into shadows, waiting to be remembered, retold, and understood as both a warning and a source of enduring inspiration. Long after the fires had died and the smoke had cleared from the plantations of St. Kitts, the story of the rebellion lingered, but almost entirely in shadows. Official records of the uprising were scarce, often distorted or sanitized by colonial authorities who feared that recounting the events in full would inspire further resistance. In the meticulous ledgers, diaries, and letters of plantation owners, the revolt was reduced to brief, clinical notes. A fire here, a minor disturbance there, a few rebellious souls punished and executed. The dramatic reality, the courage, desperation, and calculated defiance of the enslaved was systematically erased. For the colonists, forgetting was a strategy, a way to maintain the illusion of total control. And yet, the human need to remember, to preserve truth, quietly persisted among those who had lived it. Oral traditions became the fragile repository of memory. The enslaved and their descendants passed stories from one generation to the next in whispers, in songs, and in coded expressions. These accounts, though rarely recorded in written form, carried the soul of the rebellion. Elders would speak to children of the audacious acts of defiance, of torches lighting the pre-dawn sky, and of the risk undertaken for freedom. The narratives emphasized not just the physical actions, but the emotional and moral courage required to rise against a system designed to annihilate hope. In these oral histories, the enslaved became more than victims. They were strategists, heroes, and the bearers of a legacy that colonial records sought to erase. The suppression of the rebellion from mainstream history reflects the broader mechanisms of erasure common in colonial societies. Stories of resistance among the enslaved were inconvenient truths that threatened the narrative of benevolent dominion and European superiority. Schoolbooks, government documents, and public commemorations rarely acknowledged the uprising, leaving a void in collective memory. To the untrained eye, the history of St. Kitts appeared orderly and peaceful, a well-maintained sugar economy humming along the Atlantic currents. Yet beneath this veneer lay the suppressed roar of defiance, lives lived in struggle, and the extraordinary courage of those who refused submission. Historical researchers and modern scholars have since begun to reconstruct the rebellion, piecing together fragments from letters, estate records, and oral histories. Their work reveals not only the events themselves, but also the psychological complexity of the rebellion. The enslaved were not mindless aggressors. They were aware of the stakes, deeply cognizant of the risks, and morally engaged in a struggle that demanded both ingenuity and sacrifice. Every planning session, every secret gathering, every stolen moment of preparation demonstrated intelligence, foresight, and the persistent human drive for liberty. Through careful study, modern historians have begun to illuminate what colonial authorities tried so desperately to conceal. The rebellion's absence from formal history also reflects the broader invisibility of enslaved voices. Writing was largely denied to them, literacy restricted, and any attempt at documentation or testimony could be punished severely. Consequently, much of the rebellion exists today in the realm of interpretation and memory rather than concrete, detailed evidence. Yet this lack of formal acknowledgement does not diminish the truth of their actions. Instead, it underscores the resilience of memory itself, how humans, even in the most oppressive conditions, find ways to preserve stories, values, and lessons for the future. Emotional resonance plays a critical role in understanding the rebellion's legacy. Beyond tactics, strategy, and physical confrontation, the uprising was a profoundly human event, driven by the desire for dignity, self-determination, and justice. The enslaved acted not merely out of anger, but from a deep recognition of their own humanity, a refusal to accept a world in which their lives were commodified and devalued. These acts, while ultimately suppressed in written history, left a psychological imprint that resonated for decades. The courage demonstrated by those who risked everything serves as a haunting reminder of the cost of freedom and the enduring power of human resilience. In communities descended from the enslaved, echoes of the rebellion persist subtly yet powerfully. Cultural expressions, songs, dances, storytelling, and ritual carry traces of the uprising, embedding lessons of courage and defiance in the fabric of daily life. These traditions, passed down quietly, preserve a historical consciousness that defies the colonial intent to erase memory. In every narrative, whether sung, spoken, or enacted, the rebellion's spirit survives, a testament to the fact that stories rooted in struggle refuse to disappear entirely. Even the physical landscape of St. Kitts holds vestiges of the rebellion. Ruined foundations, scorched earth, and abandoned structures serve as silent witnesses to acts of courage and resistance. Though overgrown and weathered by time, these remnants provoke reflection and curiosity, encouraging the present generation to ask questions their ancestors could only whisper answers to. They are markers of human will, proof that rebellion, even when suppressed, leaves traces that cannot be fully extinguished. The long-term impact of the rebellion on collective consciousness is profound. It highlights the tension between recorded history and lived experience, the gap between what is documented and what is felt or remembered. This disparity challenges us to consider whose stories are preserved and whose are silenced, and to recognize that the true history of oppression and resistance is rarely fully captured in official accounts. For those willing to listen, The echoes of St. Kitts' rebellion offer lessons in courage, moral conviction, and the unyielding human desire for freedom, even under the most harrowing circumstances. Though nearly forgotten by mainstream history, the uprising's legacy is unmistakable in the quiet defiance that continues to echo through time. It is a reminder that even when erased from textbooks or colonial records, acts of bravery, solidarity, and resistance endure in memory, culture, and the human spirit. In reflecting on these events, one comes to understand not only the horrors of slavery, but also the extraordinary resilience of those who dared to imagine a life beyond chains, and who acted, however briefly, to seize it. The story of the St. Kitts Rebellion is not merely a tale of violence or destruction. It is a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of oppression. While the enslaved faced unimaginable cruelty, their courage, resilience, and determination illuminate what it means to fight for dignity and freedom. This final section reflects not on the mechanics of rebellion, but on the deeper truths that emerge when individuals, stripped of rights and subjected to unimaginable suffering, rise against injustice. It is a meditation on hope, courage, and the profound moral complexities of resistance. Even amidst the horror, the rebellion revealed the profound capacity for planning, coordination, and strategic thought among the enslaved. Their acts were not random outbursts of anger, but carefully calculated moves designed to achieve maximum impact. Each step of the rebellion, gathering allies, creating networks of communication, selecting targets, demonstrates intelligence, foresight, and bravery. The human mind, even under the heaviest burden of oppression, retains the capacity for ingenuity and creativity. This ability to adapt and plan, to convert despair into deliberate action, speaks to a universal truth about the human spirit. It can endure, resist, and innovate even in the darkest of circumstances. The psychological dimension of the rebellion is equally compelling. For decades, the enslaved had been subjected to systematic dehumanization, violence, and intimidation. Every day was a struggle to maintain a sense of self amidst relentless oppression. Yet, when the opportunity arose, they acted decisively, asserting their agency in ways that were both morally complex and deeply human. The rebellion was as much about reclaiming dignity as it was about physical survival. It highlighted the idea that freedom is not simply a physical condition but a state of mind, a refusal to accept subjugation as inevitable. In their courage, the enslaved asserted a fundamental truth. The human spirit cannot be entirely broken, no matter the chains imposed upon it. The acts of bravery witnessed during the uprising also remind us of the role of collective action. Individual courage was critical, but the rebellion succeeded only because people acted together, supporting one another, sharing risk, and making sacrifices for the greater good. This principle transcends historical context. It is a lesson in solidarity that resonates across generations. Communities, when united by shared purpose and moral conviction, can confront even the most formidable systems of oppression. The enslaved of St. Kitts demonstrated that courage multiplied when coupled with trust, strategy, and a shared vision of freedom. Yet the rebellion also underscores the tragic costs of resistance. Many lost their lives, were captured, or endured extreme punishment. Families were torn apart, and the immediate aftermath was one of fear and despair. These harsh realities remind us that acts of defiance are rarely without consequence, and that moral courage often carries a price that is devastatingly high. The story of St. Kitts challenges us to reflect not only on the heroism of the oppressed, but also on the structural violence that makes rebellion both necessary and perilous. It forces a reckoning with the ethical dimensions of survival, sacrifice, and justice under conditions of extreme injustice. The rebellion's lessons extend beyond the historical moment and into contemporary reflection. It forces modern audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the consequences of dehumanization. The enslaved were not merely passive victims of history. They were active agents, asserting their humanity and reshaping the world around them, however briefly. Their actions demand recognition, not only as historical facts, but as moral exemplars of courage, resilience, and ethical conviction in the face of systemic cruelty. By studying and remembering their struggle, we honor the enduring capacity for human beings to resist oppression, to act decisively in the pursuit of justice, and to inspire future generations. Emotionally, the story resonates because it reminds us of the universality of suffering and the equally universal capacity for courage. Each enslaved individual carried hopes, fears, and dreams, often hidden beneath the imposed identity of laborer or property. The rebellion illustrates that even under the weight of extreme dehumanization, people retain the ability to make morally significant choices, to act with bravery, and to assert their dignity. This lesson transcends time and geography. It is a fundamental insight into the resilience of the human heart and mind. The narrative of St. Kitts also emphasizes memory and storytelling as acts of resistance. While colonial records attempted to erase the rebellion, oral traditions, songs, and cultural memory preserved its essence. Remembering, recounting, and reflecting on the uprising is itself a continuation of the struggle, a refusal to allow injustice to be hidden or forgotten. The human spirit manifests not only in acts of physical defiance, but in the preservation of truth, the maintenance of moral integrity, and the transmission of lessons to those who come after. In this sense, the rebellion is not confined to the past. It lives in every act of courage, every story told, and every effort to confront injustice wherever it exists. In contemplating the St. Kitts Rebellion, we are reminded that darkness does not extinguish light, that oppression cannot entirely quench the desire for freedom, and that even the most dehumanizing conditions cannot fully suppress human dignity. The enslaved acted out of necessity, hope, and moral conviction, leaving behind a legacy that challenges us to recognize both the cost of injustice and the power of courage. Their rebellion, though physically suppressed, remains a symbol of the enduring human capacity to resist, to imagine, and to act in pursuit of liberty. Ultimately, the human spirit revealed in the St. Kitts Rebellion teaches us that courage, dignity, and hope can survive even under the most brutal circumstances. It calls upon us to remember, to reflect, and to act with moral clarity in our own lives. The uprising is more than a historical event. It is a lesson in resilience, solidarity, and the profound ethical imperative to confront oppression whenever and wherever it appears. It is a story that transcends its moment, illuminating the eternal capacity of the human heart to seek justice and freedom, even in the shadows of the darkest history. The uprising on St. Kitts, though brutally suppressed in its own time, left a legacy that has quietly endured through generations. While colonial records deliberately minimized or erased the rebellion, its memory survived in stories passed down within families, in songs hummed under the weight of labor, and in cultural practices that carried the essence of resistance. Today, these echoes serve as a reminder that even when history is written to favor the powerful, truth has a way of persisting in the collective memory of those who lived it. The rebellion became part of the unspoken knowledge, the shared consciousness of a community that refused to forget the courage of its ancestors. In modern scholarship, historians have begun to unearth fragments of the story, piecing together evidence from letters, estate records, and oral histories. Their work illuminates the extraordinary bravery of the enslaved, the meticulous planning behind the uprising, and the profound moral courage it required. By reconstructing these events, researchers challenge centuries of silence, revealing a history that was intentionally hidden. The rebellion's story, once confined to whispered memory, has started to emerge into the broader historical narrative, offering contemporary audiences a glimpse into a resistance that was as strategic as it was heroic. The process of modern recognition is not merely academic. It is profoundly emotional and cultural. Descendants of the enslaved, as well as communities interested in Caribbean history, have begun to reclaim the rebellion as part of their identity. By commemorating these acts of courage, they resist the centuries-long erasure that sought to deny them not only freedom, but also acknowledgement. Memorials, literature, and cultural initiatives aim to give voice to those whose stories were silenced, creating spaces for remembrance, reflection, and dialogue. In these acts of recognition, the rebellion takes on renewed significance, serving as both a warning and an inspiration. Yet the rebellion's legacy remains complex. The violence and destruction it entailed cannot be ignored, and the brutal retaliation by colonial forces left scars that persisted for generations. Families were displaced, communities destabilized, and lives irreparably changed. Recognizing the rebellion, therefore, is not merely celebrating heroism. It is acknowledging the human cost of resistance, the suffering endured, and the moral complexity of rising against a deeply entrenched system of oppression. The rebellion, in this sense, teaches that acts of defiance are intertwined with loss, sacrifice, and the enduring struggle for justice. The modern reflection on St. Kitts' rebellion also prompts broader questions about how societies remember history. Which stories are celebrated, and which are silenced? Whose perspectives are recorded, and whose are erased? The uprising offers a case study in the consequences of historical suppression and the resilience of memory. It demonstrates that even when official records attempt to dictate what is remembered, the lived experiences, the songs, the oral traditions, and the cultural practices of marginalized communities preserve truth in enduring ways. Memory itself becomes an act of defiance, a refusal to allow injustice to fade unnoticed. In education and public discourse, there is an emerging recognition of the importance of including such narratives. The St. Kitts rebellion challenges conventional histories that often focus solely on the perspective of the colonizers. By highlighting the strategies, courage, and moral agency of the enslaved, modern historians and storytellers provide a more complete, nuanced understanding of the past. This inclusive approach honors those who resisted oppression, ensuring that their stories inform contemporary reflections on freedom, justice, and human dignity. The rebellion's resonance extends beyond St. Kitts. It connects to global histories of slavery, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for human rights. By studying and reflecting on these events, modern audiences are reminded that the fight against oppression is not confined to a single era or location. The courage of the enslaved resonates with all who confront injustice, emphasizing the enduring need for vigilance, moral clarity, and solidarity in the face of systemic cruelty. Their actions, though suppressed in the historical record, offer lessons that are universal and timeless. Today, the legacy of the uprising lives in quiet ways, in the stories families tell, in the cultural expressions that have survived, and in the recognition by historians, educators, and activists. It serves as a reminder that the struggle for freedom is never fully erased and that the human spirit, even when forced into the shadows, retains the capacity to resist, to endure, and to inspire. The fires that once burned through the plantations of St. Kitts may have been extinguished physically, but the memory of courage, defiance, and hope continues to burn in the hearts and minds of those who refuse to forget. Ultimately, the rebellion's modern recognition is a triumph of memory over erasure. It demonstrates that while history can be manipulated, silenced, or distorted, the human impulse to bear witness, to honor courage, and to reclaim dignity cannot be fully suppressed. The story of St. Kitts challenges us to confront difficult truths, to honor those who fought for justice, and to recognize that the legacies of resistance continue to shape cultural, moral, and historical consciousness today. By remembering, reflecting, and acknowledging these acts of bravery, we ensure that the rebellion is no longer lost in the shadows but shines as a lasting testament to the resilience of the human spirit.